in my opinion, if you wanted to put an airplane into the most obscure part of the earth, ocean-wise, that was one of the best places to do it. The information coming out of the airplane, radios, transponders, etc., were shut down. There was one system which once an hour would send out a beep saying, yes, the system is still alive. That was still broadcasting. These pieces were found in various places, was that at some point, whether in the sky or after hitting the surface of the ocean, the aircraft was no longer intact. It's possible under two general conditions: an accident, actually three general conditions: an accident, an act of nature, or deliberate act. From the last reported position of the airplane, if it went its maximum distance it could, how big of an area of planet Earth will they have to look at? There was very little information about the whereabouts of the airplane.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience from around the globe. This is your host, Sid. To our new subscribers, welcome to the fold. And to our returning listeners, it's wonderful to have you back with us for another episode of Sit Down with Sid podcast, where we bring people together one conversation at a time. A quick note before we begin. MH370 remains a complex mystery with many conflicting theories. The views expressed by our guests are their own. Our goal is to provide a platform for various perspectives as we continue to piece together the story. Joining us today is Todd Curtis, a veteran aviation safety analyst and the founder of airsafe.com, a former Boeing safety engineer and global news commentator. Todd brings the rigorous, data driven lens this investigation demands. Todd has been connected to this mystery since day one, providing real time analysis from the moment MH370 vanished in 2014. Now, 12 years later, his expertise in flight tracking and safety protocols is more essential than ever. Todd, it is a profound honor to have you here, and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Of course. Okay, Todd, for our audience meeting you for the first time, could you share your background in aviation safety and what specifically drew your professional attention to the MH370 disappearance?
Well, certainly, it'd be my pleasure. My background in aviation started in 1978. It was the first time I had ever got inside of an aircraft and had some time maneuvering the aircraft through the sky. This was a glider when I was in college, and about a year later, I started flight training on a small Cessna in South Texas. And I got my license eventually in 1983. And after that, I was in the U.S. Air Force as a flight test engineer, where I was assisting in the development of various systems on aircraft of the mid 1980s, including some systems I thought would never work in real life, your infrared sort of things. And that became sort of like a video game now. You see those all the time, but 40 years ago, it was a brand new technology. And after that, I decided, you know what? I love aviation. Let me go in another direction, one where things don't go boom. Now, aviation safety. I had a mentor in graduate school who was a fairly well-known statistical expert, and he's Professor Arnold Barnett of MIT. And he was my mentor when it came to how do you look at aviation safety, not just from the number side of things, but from how people perceive those numbers. And one of the key things he did was he had a very small research paper where he said, let's look at the front page of the New York Times, which is the most important newspaper for pushing policy and media attention in the United States in the 1970s and 80s, and really until the internet took over in mid 2010s rather. But in those days, the New York Times was the gold standard. So we said, let's look at aviation safety. Let's look at the number of front page stories per million people killed. And it was huge. Let's look at the front page stories per million person killed for diseases like diarrhea, like cholera, etc. Much, much lower. So even though aviation very rarely killed people, the amount of media attention was way out of proportion to the actual risk to the average person. And I kept that in the back of my mind as I went out of graduate school, went to Boeing, working among other things on the 777 program as a safety engineer, and also analyzing thousands of incidents and accidents, not just Boeing incidents, but others around the world, because the perspective of the aviation industry then was we have a problem. The problem is the rate of airplanes crashing was very, very low and getting lower. But the number that the people saw was getting higher because,
Hmm.
especially after deregulation in the United States, aviation, especially large jet aviation, began growing so quickly that there was a situation where, and I remember this number, this was about 1991 when I first started at Boeing. They said, if we do nothing, by the year 2000, there might be a major airliner crash every 2 weeks. And given the kind of media that even one airplane crash from 12 years ago still generates, could you imagine if we had every 2 weeks something like what just happened in New York happening? And it would be something where you could not make the argument that the statistics are good. The average person doesn't care about statistics. They care about what they see and what they feel. Now, fast forward, I was still at Boeing. The internet, the World Wide Web became something that was useful. Around 1993, about 2 years after I started working there, we actually got computers at our desk. Yes, believe it or not, high-level Boeing engineers did not have computers on their desk, at least around me, until 1993. And one of the early things I looked at was the internet. There were very few websites. For example, the FAA, safety organizations around the world, they would have websites with basic information. And that was a great thing because before, if you wanted to get an accident report from Britain, from France, from the US, from Canada, from wherever, they were only printed. They weren't available as PDFs when I was in graduate school. And you would have to order them. You might get them after a couple of weeks, you might not. They might be in a research library, they might not be, but it was very, very rare to actually get one in your hands. And suddenly, with the internet, we could download them. This is like this is like such a great thing for us. At Boeing, one of the most important resources of information were file cabinets, large file cabinets, over a dozen, maybe 15 of them, 5, 6, meters, 2 or 3 meters wide, stacked three high, and there would be in several rooms in the building. In those file cabinets were reports, newspaper clippings, all the information that could be gathered about accidents going back to the 1950s. So before there were search engines, we had a bunch of file cabinets. And I would go through and find obscure accidents that even to this day aren't on the internet, but they were in our file cabinets. And I would try to model what's going on based on the little data we had. So when the internet came around, about 2 or 3 years later, I thought, hey, there's this concept called websites that now individuals can do. You don't have to be a big company. And I thought, what if I put together a website that just answered the questions I always get about aviation safety? By the way, I got similar questions at work, similar questions at dinner parties, similar questions in bars after people had a couple of drinks. Hey, Todd, when's the last time this airplane crashed? Todd, what's the most people ever killed in a plane crash? I thought, okay, my website will be simple. Every page will answer a question. If I hear the question more than twice, I should make a page about it. And I thought, let me take what I learned from my old professor. Whatever people are talking about is what people are interested in. So if I show them something about what they're interested in, I have a better opportunity to perhaps provide other information so they can look at aviation safety more like a serious person making their own decisions as opposed to someone just reacting what's on television or what's in the newspaper. So I always kept in my head, I don't care how many degrees I have. I don't care how many years I've worked at Boeing or how many times I've flown an airplane. But most of the people who are in aviation are intelligent people who don't have that experience. If I approach them from the point of view of, I'm the expert, I know what I'm talking about, I'd lose my audience. One of the things that would really upset me, let's say there was a plane crash on television, you would get the head of the airline or the head of the government agency investigating it. They would say, aviation safety. Aviation is very safe. Even though we just had this aircraft crash, it's safe. And I thought, okay, I'm an engineer by training. Within the aviation community, we didn't look at safety directly. We looked at safety indirectly by risk. That is, how many crashes per million flights? How many people killed per million flights? Those are risk values. You can make a definition of what the event you want to avoid. You can make a definition of how you measure things, for example, per million flights. Give you, give me, give the internet the same basic data and the same basic rules, they'll come up with the same basic risk numbers. Or even if you don't have a number, is the risk acceptable or unacceptable? The average person, if you gave them the same data, they would probably come to the same conclusion. For example, which do you think is an acceptable risk? You're sitting at the gate, you're not taking off yet, and next to you, there's a very nervous flyer, very nervous. So nervous, the person is sweating. They're like, totally afraid of being in an airplane, and they throw up. Okay, is that a risk to my life? Not a big risk. Is this something that, would make me not fly again in the future if someone threw up next to me? By the way, this actually happened. And he threw up before we even backed away from the gate. This guy was very nervous. That's an acceptable risk. It might happen because you're with people and sometimes people do things. Now, how about this risk? You're at an airport. There are 1,000 birds off the end of the runway. And the pilot said, you know what, we're taking off anyway because even if we get hit by 5 or 6 birds, we can keep flying. Most people would say that's an unacceptable risk. They would not want that person to take off. You don't have to have statistics. You don't have to have a college degree. You just have to have common sense as an individual. So going back to the internet, even I had to get an education of how to deal with the public when it comes to communicating risk. I launched my website on July 3rd, 1996, which happened to be the 8th anniversary of the United States accidentally shooting down an Iranian airliner. Given that we have a war going on right now, it's kind of coincidental that that was the reason I launched on that day because I wanted to have something that might be newsworthy. Where if I told people about the website, they might come to it because they're primed to think about aviation. 2 weeks after that was Flight 800. I was at Boeing. I was in the safety engineering department. We were directly involved with the investigation. So I couldn't say anything about it on my website because conflict of interest. I would just give factual things. This plane crashed on this date. That was about it. We spent months trying to figure out what's going on, dealing with conspiracy theories, dealing with the frustration of not really understanding what went on. We were going back and looking at airplane accidents. Remember those file cabinets I told you about? There were several very obscure events that had happened that weren't even written up as accident reports, but we knew about them because some senior person said, "Hey, Todd, go over here, 1958. We had something that sounded like this with a military aircraft." And we're trying to get ideas from all sorts of places. Let me fast forward. It turns out that the reason it blew up, we had an assumption in the industry that when you have an empty fuel tank, the center fuel tank had maybe 50 gallons of fuel in it. It's like the room I'm in was about 4 or 5 times the size of this room, maybe had a little bit of fuel on the bottom. It's a hot day in New York. The air conditioning units were near the fuel tank. They were making that area hotter. So there's fuel vapor. And the assumption was under those conditions of temperature, pressure, and fuel vapor density, even if you had a match and lit something, it wouldn't explode. Turns out that was a wrong assumption. For that reason, the design of those fuel tanks have changed so that that sort of situation wouldn't happen. But it took months for the industry collectively to figure that out. To this day, there are still conspiracy theorists who think, oh no, it was a missile that hit it. It's like, no. They recovered the airplane off the bottom of the ocean. They reconstructed it in a hangar. They had experts, not just Boeing experts, but other experts, look at what happened. And it was very consistent with an internal explosion in the fuel tank. No evidence whatsoever of anything hitting it from the outside. Yet there are still people out there. Last week, I was dealing with somebody like that who said, oh no, how could you experts say that it was a fuel tank explosion when a missile hit that aircraft? It says so right over here on the internet. Okay, that was a very short question you asked about 10 minutes ago. I gave you a very long answer.
No, 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 it's good. It's good. It's good you're sharing because once again, the whole concept here you're talking about is aviation safety. And you said I want to kind of bring my website to surface and answer these questions because once again, being in aviation, especially being an engineer for Boeing, I'm sure you must be bombarded by questions left and right. Hey, and it's funny you brought this airplane up because I remember watching this investigation, I think 4 months ago on air crash investigations, which is one of my favorite programs to watch. Not just because what it is it just stimulates my mind to think in a more creative manner. You know, I like investigative series. Uh, as a result, you can see we are doing the MH370 investigative deep dive. So thank you for sharing that. Now I'm going to take you back to MH370, March 8th, 2014. You were at SXSW the day MH370 vanished.
That's
Now,
correct. And
what were
that's the acronym for South by Southwest, which is this technology, artistic music festival that happens every year in Austin, Texas. I
yes.
was in grad school at the University of Texas, not too far from where this happened. So the first time I went 15 years ago, it's like, oh, here's an excuse to go back to Austin where I used to live and maybe see if there's interesting things here. There were very many interesting things, and I've been going back periodically ever since. 2014, I was there. The previous time I was there, I'd met up with a few friends. I was out somewhere in the venue, and there was an accident that happened. CNN happened to sponsor a basically they took over a restaurant and bar. They would have drinks and food. And they said, Todd, we're down here in Austin. Would you like to come over there and give a interview where we have our cameras? I said, okay. I've never given an interview around a whole bunch of people who are drinking and making noise. And I'm never trying to be serious. And there are people in the background drinking beer and whiskey, and I had to be serious about it. So fast forward. When I'm there the next time, I ran into the same friends. I said, look, last time was kind of crazy. I had to hang out with CNN a lot. This year, unless a plane crashes, we're going to have fun. It's Friday night. Let's go have tacos and have some fun. I sit down in the restaurant, look up at the TV in the corner. They have a 777 on the screen, MH370. It's like, oh my God, it's happened again. And
Wow.
as crazy as it was with CNN the previous time, it was about 3 or 4 times as crazy. I had requests from Britain, from the US, from Canada, and some other places I'd forgotten because things were happening so fast I couldn't even make notes. It's like, hey, Todd, can you do a radio interview right now? I said, sure, let me find a closet where no one's making noise.
So, Todd, my follow-up on that is based on your background, what were those first 48 to 72 hours like from a safety analyst perspective as the data began to trickle in? Like, what was going on?
Well, you have to go back in time a few months to the first fatal 777 event, which was in 2013. It was in San Francisco. This was, you might remember this, it was coming in for landing. It landed short of the runway. 3 people were
China,
killed.
yes.
It was the first fatal accident of a 777. And I'm sitting in a restaurant in New York, and I happened to open up my computer waiting for a friend. I was at a, believe it or not, I was at a cupcake shop. We wanted to have cupcakes for breakfast. And I open up my computer, and it's like CNN has this giant headline about the 777 crash. And I thought, oh my God, this is the first fatal crash. And here's how my mind works. First fatal crash. I knew it would happen eventually, and nobody called me. Now, why am I saying that? I had been on television, national, international television, since the first time was 1999. So this was like 14 years later. I'd been on CNN, MSNBC, BBC, and several others. And typically after a major plane crash, I would get calls or emails or texts saying, would you like to come talk to us? There was nothing. The date was July 6th, 2013. Now, in the US, July 4th is a huge holiday. That year, it happened to land on a Thursday. So, what happened was a lot of people took this as an opportunity to have a 4 day weekend. The official holiday was Thursday, but a lot of people either officially or unofficially took Friday off. So, I'm sitting there on Saturday and I'm thinking, no one called me. And I'm calling around everyone I knew, including CNN. I knew someone in Atlanta from like 3 years ago. I called that person. I said, oh, you're in New York? Well, we have a studio about 3 blocks from where you are right now. Why don't you go to the studio and do something with this. And I thought, great. I thought it was going to be a tiny little box of a studio. Typically, when I get on television, I go to some satellite location. You put me in a small room, dark, a camera, a couple of lights. I talk for 5 minutes, then I leave. And I thought this would be one of those things. I'll do this for 5 or 15 minutes, then I'll go party because it's New York on the weekend. I was meeting friends. And I go in there. It's not a small satellite setup. It was actually their main broadcasting location. There were about 50 desks on the lower floor. Three people were working. It's like, oh my God, everyone's on vacation. And over in a tiny platform above it all was Don Lemon, who was one of the primary CNN presenters at that time. I thought, oh my goodness, I get to sit down next to Don Lemon, not in some little studio somewhere. I thought I'd be there for 15 minutes. I'd be able to tell my friends and my family, hey, I was sitting there next to Don Lemon. I feel like, this is like a great day for me. Yes, people died, but it's like I have to think, yes, this is a tragedy, but this is an opportunity to communicate to the world. And I have to balance the reality of people got killed with the other reality that there are very short windows of opportunity to get the media's attention, to put facts and data out there and not rumor. And I looked at this as my opportunity to give some context. I didn't know what caused the crash. I barely knew anything about the flight, but I can give context about how has this kind of crash happened before? Has anything even close to this ever happened with the 777? Were the fire and rescue crews, were they doing a good job? And trying to answer questions like that. And I thought, okay, 15 minutes, they went to commercial. I thought, I'll shake Don Lemon's hand and I'll leave. They said, Dr. Curtis, we can't find anybody else. Can you stay here for a few more minutes? I thought, okay, another 15 minutes. It turned into 5 hours. Myself and
Wow.
Don Lemon for 5 hours going back and forth giving information. We would go to commercial. We would both whip out Twitter, look for things. I said, Don, how about this? Nope, we don't have any corroboration. How about this? Yes, we have reporters who corroborate that. Good. We'll talk about this. Then you'll talk about that. Then I'll talk about this. We come back off commercial. Yes, this is what happened. This is what I think happened. So we were planning and executing in real time. And at the end of the night, it was about 10:30 at night, Fox News calls. By the way, in New York, Fox News, which is, a very conservative network, and CNN, which is a very liberal network by comparison, MSNBC, they're all within a few blocks of each other. So it's like they called me up, they sent over a car. I drive through Times Square at midnight in the back of a black car, and I'm thinking, I've been in Times Square at midnight before, but never was I being chauffeured around. And I go into the Fox News studio. I didn't know any of these people. I walk into the studio. I sit down behind the desk. There are four of them and myself. We talk for about an hour. Then at midnight, it ends. Here's the funniest part of it. One of the people got up from behind the desk. He had a coat and jacket on. And below that, he had Bermuda shorts. And I thought, it's actually true. They don't wear fancy clothes under the desk. So that was an unusual situation. But again, the opportunity was there. There was no one else available. I had time to do this. So, you know, in an ideal world, I would have zero opportunity to be on TV. In an ideal world, no one would ever call me. But until that ideal world happens, I'd rather have people who are reasonable on television than people who are not reasonable.
Hmm. And also, you mentioned the media's hunger for talking heads in the early days when it came to MH370. Um, how did that intense pressure for immediate answers affect the accuracy of information that was being reported to the public at that time?
Well, what's the phrase? Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the media. There was very little information about the whereabouts of the airplane. In fact, I did a bit of calculation. From the last reported position of the airplane, if it went its maximum distance it could, how big of an area of planet Earth will they have to look at? And I put it in a way that people can understand. All of North America, all of South America, all of Western Europe, and I think there was another country. If you put all those land masses together, that's the search area. Now,
Really?
unfortunately, it was, again, it was a simple math thing. Take How many hours can it fly on the fuel load it had? Draw a circle. What's that area of the Earth? Now, part of it was, of course, Asia and Australia, but most of it was ocean. Fortunately, there was enough information. I believe a couple of researchers from Inmarsat, which is one of the satellite services used by ships and elsewhere, and aircraft, were able to narrow down the possible places where the plane could be. For reasons that are as yet unknown, the information coming out of the airplane, radios, transponders, etc., were shut down. There was one system which once an hour would send out a beep saying, yes, the system is still alive. That was still broadcasting. That was the only way they were able to track it. They had a couple of satellites, they triangulated. They said, okay, given the math of the situation, it has to be on an arc over the Indian Ocean. Coincidentally, in my opinion, if you wanted to put an airplane into the most obscure part of the Earth, ocean-wise, that was one of the best places to do it. It's never been a part of the ocean that's had a lot of commercial traffic. It's never been a part of the ocean that was a focus of the Cold War, especially between the US and USSR. And it's very deep in places. And it's relatively unexplored compared to the North Atlantic and other parts of the world.
Hmm. And so I want to ask about now being an engineer, right? Planes go up, planes go down. I said this. Yeah, planes don't vanish. Like, are you there scratching your head? Like, how is this even possible? Like, is this even possible to begin with? Like, the plane has
Well,
vanished.
it's possible under two general conditions: an accident, actually three general conditions: an accident, an act of nature, or deliberate act. I'm not saying a criminal act. I'm not saying an illegal act, a deliberate act. The aircraft was going toward China, normal flight path, and shortly after communication, the last communication with air traffic control, the um, transponder and other equipment was turned off, and the plane made a very, not a small turn, a fairly almost 90-degree turn going toward the west and going in a direction that would take it as far as possible from major land masses as it went to the Indian Ocean. Now, if it's an accident, if there's some sort of malfunction that would cause both a loss of communication and cause the aircraft to fly in a controlled manner for several hours in a very specific direction, if there's an accident that could cause that, I wasn't aware of any of that happening. For example, let's say they were reprogramming the flight control computer, and in the middle of reprogramming it, they passed out. Well, if the middle of the reprogramming is taking it in a direction completely away from where you're going, that made no sense. Well, could it be an act of nature? There was enough information about atmospheric conditions from other aircraft, from ground stations and such, where there were no unusual weather issues going on, no huge thunderstorms, no typhoons, nothing like that. No space weather incidents. For example, you could have a solar flare that could disrupt communication and possibly disrupt the inner workings of computers. Nothing like that going on. A deliberate action. Is it conceivable that there was a safety issue such that the crew felt it's absolutely important to turn the aircraft in a particular direction? Or for that matter, is there some sort of onboard problem, loss of cabin pressure or smoke in the cockpit, where they had to turn the aircraft? Possible, but unless we have the black box information, it's impossible to know that. By the way, even if today they were to recover the cockpit voice recorder, there wouldn't be anything on it from the time of making the turn because I believe that box only had about 2 hours worth of recording time. And after 2 hours, it's recorded over on top. And it was, I don't know, 5 or 6 hours before the aircraft presumably ran out of fuel. So if they were to recover the box tomorrow, they would probably hear either silence because there's no one talking, or a lot of people talking because they're trying to figure out what's going on.
Wow. And in 2014, how visible was a commercial airliner to the global tracking systems? And was there any like immediate safety consensus on how could a 777 just disappear?
Well, a couple of things. The flight crew in an airliner, this isn't just Boeing airliners, most airliners, can manually switch on and off systems for whatever reason. So let's say, for example, there is an electrical situation where they're trying to locate the problem or trying to keep equipment from overheating because they're afraid there's a problem with it. Yeah, that would be a reason to cut off a transponder and such. Um, but there's several systems. You have a transponder that responds to radar beams hitting it. You have what's called ADS-B, Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, which broadcasts on a regular basis a unique identifier about the aircraft, its altitude, its airspeed, its identity, etc. To have them both go out simultaneously, independently, that speaks to some common cause. Was it hit by lightning? Was there a midair collision? Or did the crew, one or both crew members, turn them off? So when you have those systems over the ocean, you have some level of observability because without going into technical details, I've heard about radar. It's been around since even before World War II. Radar relies on a microwave energy sort of wave going out and bouncing back. That's called primary radar. There's another system, a transponder, where if it senses a radar signal, it automatically sends out another signal which has unique identifiers, altitude, etc. So even if you turn the transponder off, if you have a primary radar, I think there were a couple in Thailand, perhaps, can't remember the other country, primary radar, which did get a radar return from the aircraft. ADS-B, that is an internal system only. It doesn't rely on some signal from the outside. It automatically broadcasts a signal. Now, at the time, you did not have satellite-based ADS-B like you have now. So if you were out of the range of ground stations to receive an ADS-B signal, you might not get anything. So even if they had kept the ADS-B system on, once they went over the open ocean, there wouldn't be any tracking of it. But in short, there are several ways to track aircraft. And the Inmarsat system I talked about as well. There's a system where engineering information, technical information can be sent out automatically at periodic um, times to send back to maintenance headquarters so they can get a running tally of what's the health of the airplane, are there any problems, etc. Fast forwarding to, I believe it was 2000, or actually going back in time, the Air France 447 event that got lost over the South Atlantic. It was actually broadcasting that type of information constantly. And that system was not cut off. It was active the whole time. So yes, there are several ways of tracking the aircraft. And a very basic way is they can ask other aircraft in the area, do you see the lights of flight MH370 out your window? And although it was not a heavily trafficked part of the world, not like Western Europe or North America, there were other aircraft in the area who, if air traffic control asked, they could say, hey, look, do you see this airplane in your vicinity?
Hmm. Uh, Todd, so the main thing I want to talk about here is the 777's electrical architecture. As a former Boeing safety engineer, could you walk us through that electrical architecture, specifically regarding the relog on of the satellite unit at 1825 UTC? Now, my question to you is it technically possible for the aircraft's power management system to reboot that unit automatically during a failure, or does the design require a manual intervention? And feel free to be as technical as you want because our audience loves the technical deep dive, please.
Oh, it will be very non-technical. I left Boeing in 2000, and I was heavily involved in my department's um, overseeing of the safety aspects of those systems. And back then, I was very, very, very well versed about the electrical system, what systems were powered by it, how can you switch from one electrical bus to another. That knowledge is gone from my head, but in general, I can give you very, very high level description of the power system on the 777. You basically have three different sources of electrical power. You have batteries, and the battery can typically is powering certain aspects of the aircraft. You have power generators in both engines, and it's a two-engine aircraft. So you have an ability to independently power any of the main power buses with either one of those generators. You also have something in the back called an auxiliary power unit, which is another jet type engine which is not there for propulsion. It's a turbine engine that is generating power for use on the aircraft. So in short, if there is a power problem, either you're not getting power from a particular generator or there's a problem with that system, you can pull the energy from another generator onto the bus that's a problem bus, or you can isolate devices by turning that bus off, switching circuit breakers, etc. With respect to the specific device we're talking about, I no longer familiar. Even then, I wasn't familiar with that particular uh, device and how it was operated in the cockpit.
Hmm. Okay, it's no problem. And I want to know. I know you were also involved on the media appearances, and I'm sure you were getting a lot of questions. Um, in your experience, or to your knowledge, where did you see was the biggest disconnect between the actual safety data and the mainstream media's portrayal of the MH370 disappearance?
Well, the disconnect happened almost immediately because, well, in part, well, in the immediate aftermath, when the plane was first missing, the conspiracy theorists weren't out there because, as with any uh, aircraft event, especially a missing aircraft event, the concern is the aircraft is missing. Let's start a search. And that was being done very quickly by not just the Malaysian authorities, but other authorities in the area that were searching any particular area of the South China Sea, I believe it was. And a couple days after that, a few days after that, I saw in a news source that the U.S. 7th Fleet, which I believe was the fleet that was in that vicinity, was changing direction and going toward the Indian Ocean. I thought, okay, they haven't officially said this yet, but clearly the United States or someone supplying information to the United States thinks that the airplane's not where they think it was. And that is when I started to hear various kinds of conspiracy theories. It's like, oh, within a few days or a few weeks, there are a lot of people from China working for a particular kind of company. Was this an opportunity to take them out? Were there a bunch of illegal batteries in the cargo hold that caught fire? Was this an intelligence operation? All speculation, not based on any fact. And as time wore on, and the world's attention was riveted on this, there was a real concern. Where's this airplane? Is it possible it's actually flying to, this is the craziest one, that it flew to Diego Garcia, which is an island in the Indian Ocean, which I knew enough about the 777. It did not have enough fuel to get to Diego Garcia. Then there are conspiracy theories. Maybe it landed in some interim place. They fueled up the aircraft and they flew it away again. And again, that's a conspiracy theory that sounds good on paper, but there is no factual evidence to back up any part of that. Were there any unusual aircraft seen on radar or seen coming or going from a location? And let me tell you, if a 777 shows up at an airport where a 777 has never showed up before, it would be noticed. If a 777 showed up at an airport where 777s regularly show up, it's probably going to be a control tower airport. They will know who's there and who's not there. It's hard to hide a large jet airliner in in any part of the world. And that was the disconnect. There was, and again, the internet was a very important player here, for good and for bad. I have nothing against the internet. I've been on the internet for 30 years. I've over time developed a thick skin for bad information. Even the worst conspiracy theorists sometimes have a grain of truth in what they're saying. And sometimes I look at what's being said, even though it might be ridiculous on the surface, and I would say to myself, are they bringing up an issue that might actually be a real issue? And if I look at that conspiracy in a different light, as in that's their conspiracy, do I have a place to find information that will either confirm or not confirm that there's some possible truth to that conspiracy theory?
Hmm. And Todd, from a safety analysis standpoint, how much weight do you give the handshake data, and are there any technical vulnerabilities in that data that should be considered?
Well, the handshake data, which I believe is the same data that the Inmarsat folks were going for, I give a lot of credence to that because the analysis they had was based on their knowledge of the system, their knowledge of electromagnetic waves and how fast they fly. And they were able to, again, based on what their knowledge was of the physics of the situation, the mechanics of the situation, and the technologies that were being involved, both transmitting and receiving the signal, they came up with a testable hypothesis. If you didn't believe their numbers, if you didn't believe their analysis, you can take the same information, do a different analysis. If you come up with a different answer from them, good. Compare the two and have even more people come in and say, okay, after looking at both sets of data, either this one's right, or something else is correct. That sort of thing, I put a lot of credence in because even if there were inconsistencies or incorrect processes that were done, it is something that others who have as much or more insights could analyze. Conspiracy theories, not so much.
Hmm. So Todd, from what I can tell is you're a person of facts. So I'm going to ask you straight away. You know, there have been conspiracies, hijacking, hypoxia, uh, pilot murder suicide, manual intervention. Based on your experience, once again, as a background, as your professional background, what is your theory? Or let's say, what is your factual analysis, since I don't want to use the word conspiracy for yourself?
Well, let's start toward the end of the story. That is, after the aircraft went missing, some months and even some years after it went missing, there are actually several pieces of the aircraft that washed up on the shores of Reunion Island, Madagascar, I believe parts of Africa. Some of the pieces that washed up had actual identifying information on them, where they can positively identify which part this was from the aircraft. Other pieces didn't have identifying information. It was consistent with things such as an interior cabin wall. And there was also one that was with a identification mark, a flaperon, which is a flap that's on one of the wings. What this said to me, the fact that these pieces were found in various places, was that at some point, whether in the sky or after hitting the surface of the ocean, the aircraft was no longer intact, especially having that interior piece from an interior wall of the aircraft. It's one thing to, let's say, ditch an aircraft and you might have a flap tear off because it's on the outside on the wing. But for something on the inside of the cabin to break off, that means there has to be a catastrophic failure of some kind of the cabin. I don't know if there was a controlled ditching or an uncontrolled ditching, but given that those pieces were found floating in the ocean, my theory, backed up by those facts, is that it landed in the ocean. Now, did it run out of fuel and then go in? Was it deliberately done that way? I don't know. Was it because the crew suffered from hypoxia? Was it because, and this is not a conspiracy theory, but it's a possibility. You could have a situation where one or both cabin crew members put on their oxygen masks, slowly decompress the cabin, where people essentially slowly pass out and possibly even go into a coma or die from hypoxia, and yet they still have oxygen. And they would be left alone in the aircraft to keep flying. And now that is technically possible, but less likely if it took two pilots. That is, if both pilots were alive, because to say that you're doing this deliberately to kill everybody on board, I can see one person deciding to do that for whatever reason. I seriously doubt that the second pilot would agree with that first pilot to go along with the plan. Does this mean, as has been suspected in a completely different accident that happened in the early 90s, that somehow or another the one of the flight crew members incapacitated the other flight crew member before crashing the airplane deliberately?
Hmm.
Or one that happened more recently in China. I remember seeing this picture. It was like a 737 coming straight down. Backstory. The first officer who was on that aircraft had failed a test where he had been a captain with the airline. He failed some test and he was relegated to the first officer. The person who failed him was his captain that day.
Wow.
Coincidental. And some people would surmise, well, was there perhaps a bad feeling between the first officer toward the captain or the captain toward the first officer? Because it was, let's put it this way, there's an international way of doing business when it comes to accident investigations, putting out a report, etc. However, If it turns out to be a deliberate action, there is no international standard for putting out a report about a deliberate action. Some countries do, others, like the United States, don't. And I don't believe I've ever seen any official report from this accident in China, from this crash in China. I'm not going to call it an accident.
Okay. We had Blaine Gibson, who had the privilege of having him on the show, and he's someone who actually recovered those pieces, especially the interior, the cabinet interior as well. And so it's good to know that you are well aware of all these things, and you're trying to base your opinion about what happened based on the things that you saw. You know. Um, so now let's say you said it went in the ocean, right? I want to talk about the Ocean Infinity search, which just concluded on March 8th, once again of this year, exactly on the day of this, on the 12th year anniversary. Now they have cleared thousands more square kilometers of the high probability zones using the most advanced marine robotics in history. Now back to your safety analysis lens. Does this empty-handed result suggest the search technology is hitting a physical limit, or does it fundamentally invalidate the flight path models that have been relied on for the last decade or so?
I don't believe it invalidates the models at all. Simply put, the ocean, that part of the ocean they're searching is rather large. And it's possible that even if they passed over the site where it was, that the signal or the information they had was not clear enough to differentiate between whatever the background noise was and whatever the aircraft is. Let's put it this way. If the aircraft very smoothly landed in the ocean and was largely intact, sank in one piece, that's one thing. If it had a high energy impact where it's essentially shatters the aircraft, certain large pieces like the engine and landing gear would not tend to drift so much. Other pieces would drift quite a bit. And in case of the things found on the surface, they drifted thousands of miles. Well, it's conceivable that you could have all sorts of pieces of the aircraft float down to the bottom, but spread out over a very, very, very wide area. By the way, one of the things that caught my eye in the initial search for the aircraft in the ocean, there were a couple of, I think, World War II ships that had been found like 14,000 feet below the surface. They had been sunk in the 1940s and were never found. They were found. So, and a ship, even a small ship, a small destroyer, much, much bigger, much heavier, much more of a tangible target than an airliner. So I don't
But
think it invalidates the model. And like I said before, the Indian Ocean has not been a huge interest area for the great powers of the world, not like the North Atlantic. You might remember the fact that I think this was the 1980s. Robert Ballard discovered the site of the Titanic. Well, Robert Ballard had been doing a lot of work in oceanography, some of it for the military, and the North Atlantic has been one of the most researched underwater areas of the world for a whole bunch of reasons, one of them being for the United States and the Soviet Union and NATO countries. That sort of intense study of the ocean bottom does not occur in that part of the Indian Ocean.
and how much do you believe the story that it's near the seventh arc? How much credibility you give to that specific seventh arc where they have been trying to locate this plane?
I give a lot of credibility to it, again, because of the background research that had been done for that. Does it mean that it landed in the seventh arc? Here's what I say, and I've said this for years. I fully believe they will find the wreckage of MH370. I also fully believe that anyone listening to your podcast right now will not be alive to see that, much like the Titanic. It will happen, just not anytime soon.
And what makes you feel so confident? I mean, that's a very bold, confident statement coming from your end.
It's a
Like
bold
you.
opinion. Why
Mhm.
do I make such bold opinions? I know enough about the internet to say that if you just stick with facts and data, you'll get an audience. If you say something bold, possibly right, possibly wrong, you'll get a bigger audience. And more importantly, you'll get that audience to think. The
Hmm.
reason the Titanic was found in part was because there had been a concerted effort for decades to study the ocean, not to find the Titanic, but for other reasons. If there is an economic or military reason to understand that part of the Indian Ocean to a very, very fine degree, then it's much more likely that it will be found. But I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Hmm. I have a couple of more questions, Todd, before we wrap this up. I want to talk about, there has been a lot of these theories, a lot of online things going on. The role of the government played in finding the source. Uh, some have not seen them as credible. Some are okay with it. What is your take on how the officials and the governments involved in this entire operation since 2014? What is your perception about doing that?
Well, remember I mentioned earlier about the international agreements that exist for accident investigations. There are some countries, the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Australia, who have been at the forefront of aviation and have had the opportunity to investigate at a very deep level hundreds of accidents over the years. And the level of detail and the level of credibility that those organizations have due to the fact that A, they have an incentive to do it well because it's a big business. B, they have the resources to make it happen. But by international agreement, the country responsible for the investigation is specified based on the nature of the accident. And the Malaysians were the lead country doing this. In the United States and elsewhere, the Aviation Investigation Organization is separate, independent from, for example, the Civil Aviation Organization. In the US, the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, investigates accidents. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, manages the air traffic system, promotes aviation, and does other things. Those two are not the same organization. In fact, an investigator told me that when he was from the NTSB, when he was an investigator, there was a major accident, and the investigation team was getting on a government airplane to go to this accident. The head of the FAA asked if he could ride along to go to the accident because he wanted to be there too. And the lead investigator had the power and authority to tell him no, because it would be the appearance of a conflict of interest. So he could not go at his convenience at that aircraft. He had to find another way there. And I asked him, in today's political environment, do you think a low level, relatively low level person at the NTSB could tell the administrator who's chosen by the president no? He said, probably not. Well, the situation in Malaysia is not like either of those situations here in the United States, but there is a relationship between the airline, which was government owned or government controlled, the government, and the organization that's investigating the accident. And if hypothetical, I don't know if there was something that was embarrassing or, you know, something they should have caught but didn't, that would hurt the reputation of the airline. It might hurt the tourism industry. And the people with the decision authority over how the investigation goes might say, you know what? Don't do that part of the investigation because it will look bad to us. That could happen in the United States and elsewhere as well. But the relationship between the investigators and the other parts of the government were much closer in Malaysia than here. Another practical thing, they did not have the resources to bring to bear to that. Let's go back in time to the Egypt Air event where the aircraft was flying out of the United States going to Egypt. It crashed fairly close to the United States. By international agreement, it was the Egyptian airliner. Egypt was the lead organization to do the investigation. The Egyptian government allowed the United States government to take over the investigation because they had all the resources. They were willing to spend tens of millions of dollars on it. At the end, the Egyptian government did not like the conclusion of the American government. The conclusion of the American government was one of the pilots deliberately flew it into the ocean. The Egyptian government disagreed, and that's where it stood. Because the Malaysian government was running an investigation, there's no way the Malaysian government, in my opinion, would disagree with its own findings.
Wow, very well said. Okay, couple of things more. 12 years later, we have system like GADSS and a 1 minute tracking, distress tracking. Have these changes truly solved the mystery of a disappearing plane? Or do you think, are there still any safety blind spots still in 2026?
Oh, there are absolutely safety blind spots. One of them being the level of, let's just say, the level of effort toward aviation safety depends on the kind of flying you're doing. Now, I happen to personally fly a small private airplane on occasion, which has today way more sophisticated electronics than anything I flew 30 or 40 years ago. When I was at Boeing in the early 1990s, the kinds of systems that were on the top level airliners are now common in the smallest airplanes. Are there still safety blind spots? Certainly. The biggest blind spots are with the people who operate the aircraft. If you have someone, whether it's an airline or a private pilot, who operates in a manner that is not in keeping with standard procedures, and that might be dangerous, you have an opportunity or more likelihood of having an accident. For example, there's a type of airplane called a Cirrus. Small airplane, very sophisticated. It has a parachute system. If you have a problem in the air, you could pull a handle and a parachute deploys. The Cirrus company says, okay, this parachute system works in a particular way. You have to have a particular altitude and airspeed for this to work properly. Otherwise, we can't guarantee anything. There was an accident that my colleagues and I looked at. It was a Cirrus airplane that took off, had a problem immediately after takeoff. And there was a lot of empty fields around. The pilot with the engine failure could have said, I will do the standard procedure. I look for a place to land. That decision would probably mean that the airplane would be damaged to the point of not being repaired. It was like a $500,000 airplane. This person who was flying the plane was worth a lot more than a $500,000. It was clear to me, from the accident description, that he wasn't in a serious mindset to be a pilot. He was taking his kids to go to some water park. And the witnesses said, yes, they went onto the plane dressed in their swimming outfit and whatnot, like they're going to the beach. And I said to myself, no, you're going to the beach eventually, but you're in the airplane right now. If you were acting like a responsible pilot, he'd say, look, you're going to wear regular clothes. I'm going to brief to you as a passenger what to do if things go wrong. And this pilot, instead of the engine's out, let me try and restart the engine. If not, let me land the plane. He decided, let me pull the parachute. The plane was about 1,800 feet too low for the parachute to work properly. If he had read the instructions, reviewed them on a regular basis, he would know that the parachute is not the first or the last place to go. That parachute was useless at that altitude. So the biggest blind spots is not the technology. It's the people operating the aircraft, the organizations that are responsible for repairing and maintaining that aircraft, the training systems that are in place to teach good discipline to not just professional pilots, but to average pilots, to private pilots. All of that contributes to the system we have today. And if individuals and organizations don't do what they can to reduce the excess risk, you'll have accidents that are avoidable.
Hmm. Wow. Final question for the day, Todd, for you is beyond the MH370 mystery, what is the most important lesson the aviation industry should have learned from this event regarding transparency and safety data?
I think the most important lesson is a lesson that was learned through a lot of bad accidents over the years. Uh, Countries like the United States and Japan, Australia, and Canada do aviation so well because they've had experience with when things go bad. And from that experience, more procedures come into play, a different attitude comes into play, and a certain, how should I say it, certain conservatism when it comes to how do we work with this technology in the real world. None of the countries, no matter who you are, none of the people who work in aviation have the luxury of stopping everything, fixing everything, and flying. There are things that are flying out there right now, some flying well, some flying badly, some flying illegally. There are, this was something that came up at this accident in LaGuardia that happened just a few days ago. There are procedures in place to deal with the fact that Late at night, you don't have a lot of people, and not a lot of traffic. Maybe you could staff air traffic control with fewer people doing more jobs, and it won't be a problem. For the most part, that is the case. I don't know if it was a case in LaGuardia, but that's certainly going to be a very serious question to look at. The assumptions we had before as to what is acceptable, are those assumptions still true given the most recent data we have?
Hmm. Well, Todd, I want to thank you very much for your time. And it was quite a fascinating conversation. And you reminded us today that safety is not a static state, but a constant evolving pursuit of the truth. To our audience, if this conversation moved you, please share it. In the world of fleeting digital noise, our collective attention is the only thing that keeps the search for the truth alive. By listening, you ensure this story and the 239 souls it represents are never truly lost to the deep. Todd
If I
Curtis,
may,
once again. Yeah,
yeah,
please,
let me
go for it.
get one more
Please.
message to the audience. I think I said this earlier in the show. I happen to be an aviation expert. That doesn't make me the only voice that should be out there. If you're out there, even if you don't fly, even if you're not a passenger, you know people who are involved in aviation or who will fly on the airplane. The decisions everyone makes, the suggestions you give to people could be useful to keep things from happening. So don't believe just because you don't have a degree or a license or experience or time on television doesn't mean that you don't have something to contribute. Do what you can from where you are.
Wow. Todd, once again, it was such an honor. And thank you so much for taking the time to accept our invite and be on the show. And we have listed your website in the description. So if people want to check out your website, they can feel free to. And once again, thank you. And this was fun having you on the show. Thank you, sir.
It was fun being on the show. Thank you.
You take care. Bye bye.
You too. Bye bye.